Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Ready to dive into a really chilling case today.
Always.
This one, it's going to stay with you. Donald Harvey,
Ah, yeah. Angel of Death.
the angel of death, right? He confessed to 37 murders, but
But thought to be way more.
yeah, a lot of people think it's way more. We've got excerpts from his Wikipedia page and then a table outlining like confirmed victims. But we're not just listing facts, right?
Right.
We want to understand what drove this guy, a hospital orderly, to do these horrible things and how to get away with it so long.
But this case, it really makes you think about human nature and the systems we have.
Yeah.
It's easy to say, oh, he's a monster. But we got to understand his story, like especially his early life. That's key to figuring this out.
Yeah, okay, so let's go back to the beginning. Born in Ohio, but raised in Kentucky, in poverty, dropped out of school in ninth grade, and there are signs of a really rough past.
Yeah, and that past, that's a big piece of this. Harvey, he was sexually abused for years by an uncle and a neighbor from like age 5 to 18. That kind of trauma, I mean, it just messes you up, psychologically, changes how you see the world, maybe even your sense of empathy.
It's just awful to think about. And then, after a burglary arrest, he joined the Air Force, but discharged after just 9 months, after two suicide attempts.
Yeah, that's some serious turmoil right there. And it makes you wonder, how did someone with all this end up working in healthcare in a position of trust? It shows how weak the system was back then for checking people's backgrounds. Like the system itself was almost setting things up for this to happen.
Right, and then it gets really dark. 1970, he's only 18, gets a job as an orderly at a hospital in Kentucky. That's where the killing started. He confessed to at least a dozen murders there in just 10 months, mostly by suffocating patients.
This is classic angel of death situation. People in healthcare, they have access to vulnerable people and, well, they take advantage of that. And a lot of times they say they're doing it out of mercy, like Harvey did. Said he wanted to ease their pain, the terminally ill patients.
Yeah, that easing the pain thing, that's where it gets really tricky. Ethically, psychologically, do you think he meant it? Or was that just an excuse for something darker?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Was there any good intention there at the start, even if it was messed up? Or was that just a cover for something truly evil? I think it's probably a mix of things. His past, maybe mental illness, and then this growing fascination with death, with control. It's a recipe for disaster.
And his methods, they got worse, a lot worse. Not just easing pain anymore, arsenic, cyanide, insulin, even messing with IVs, and using a coat hanger to hurt people internally. That doesn't sound like someone trying to be merciful.
Nope. And how his methods changed, that's important for understanding what was going on in his head. It makes you think, did he start out wanting to help, and then it turned into something else, something darker, about power, deciding who lives and dies? It's a scary thought.
And it wasn't just patients who were dying. He killed his roommate's father, poisoned his roommate so he wouldn't move out, even killed a neighbor with arsenic in a pie. No mercy there, just violence all over the place.
Yeah, there's no way you can call those mercy killings. This is something way more messed up going on in his mind. It seems like having that power over life and death, it just took over him, corrupted him.
And he got away with it for 17 years, moving between hospitals in Ohio, Marymount, the Cincinnati VA, Drake Memorial. It's mind-blowing how he stayed under the radar that long.
Yeah, how he wasn't caught for so long, that's really troubling. A few things helped him. Back then, they didn't check backgrounds as well, so he slipped through. And he used so many different ways to kill, it was hard to connect the dots.
You think he did that on purpose? To avoid getting caught?
Maybe. It could mean he knew how to work the system. Plus, he often targeted patients who were already really sick. So their deaths didn't seem that unusual. It shows how someone like him can take advantage of weaknesses in the system.
And the worst part, some nurses had concerns. They saw something was wrong. But the hospitals, they didn't listen. It's like they just couldn't believe someone in healthcare could be doing this.
Yeah, it makes you wonder about those hospitals back then. Did they not want to believe it? Were they scared of bad publicity? We got to ask these questions if we want to stop this from happening again.
The case broke in 1987. A guy, John Powell, he was in a motorcycle accident on life support for months. Then he suddenly dies, and they find cyanide. That's what started to unravel everything.
And that's when his past catches up to him. Remember, he had done weird things before, like stealing body parts. That should have been a warning sign. But with the cyanide, he became the main suspect.
They questioned him. He admitted to killing Powell, still said it was mercy. But this TV anchor, Pat Mennerson, from WCPO, he kept digging, wouldn't let it go. He was a big reason they found out how bad it really was.
Mennerson, he is a real investigative journalist. He knew someone like Harvey who might have been killing for years. Wouldn't just stop. He went on TV, asked people if they knew about other suspicious deaths. That's when those nurses, who had been quiet before, they came forward. That's what blew the case wide open.
It's amazing they were so brave to speak up after being ignored before. With all this evidence and the public getting angry, Harvey's lawyer, he had to do something to avoid the death penalty.
Yeah, he was afraid Harvey would get executed, so he made a deal. Life in prison if Harvey confessed to everything. It was controversial. A lot of people didn't like it, but at least the family's got some answers, and we learned the horrifying details.
They questioned him for hours. He confessed to 24 murders, then later admitted to 9 more at that first hospital in Kentucky. That brought the total to 37.
And the scary thing is, even after all that, he said he might have killed 50 people. Some people think it could be as many as 87, like he said at first. We might never know for sure, which is a terrifying thought.
It's a chilling question mark over the whole case. Harvey went to prison in Ohio in 1987, stayed there until he died in 2017, found beaten in his cell, died 2 days later. Another inmate was convicted of his murder.
It's a dark ending to a dark story. But we can't forget how much this case changed things in healthcare. It showed how important it is to check people's backgrounds carefully, have better rules, and most importantly, a culture where people speak up if they see something wrong.
Absolutely. It was a wake-up call for hospitals everywhere. They changed how they hire people, how they report suspicious things, and they became more careful. As terrible as it was, what happened with Harvey might have stopped other tragedies from happening.
The complicated legacy. But before we get into the media and all that, let's talk about the victims themselves. They were more than just numbers. Their stories, their tragedies, they need to be remembered.
I agree completely. Let's take a moment to remember them and think about the real human cost of what Harvey did.
Yeah.
This table, it lists all 37 of Harvey's confirmed victims. It's just a powerful reminder that these weren't just numbers. These were real people, with families, with stories.
It's easy to get caught up in how many people he killed. But each name, it's a whole life lost. Families and communities were shattered by this.
The youngest victim was only 42, the oldest 91. Men, women, different races, backgrounds. It shows it wasn't about mercy, not at all.
Right. It wasn't about who they were. It was about him, his need to control, like playing God, choosing who lived and died. And he used so many ways to kill, too. Suffocation, arsenic, cyanide, even rat poison. Tampering with IVs, turning off ventilators. Any way he could, really.
It's almost like he was, experimenting, trying to find the best way to kill.
Yeah, that's pretty disturbing, but it might be true.
Yeah.
There's a pattern here, not just in the killings, but how he went about it. He even wrote down his methods. Kept a lock of hair from one victim, Cleofish, burned it after she died. It's awful, but it gives us a glimpse into his mind. He was fascinated by death, needed to control not just the killing, but the memory of it, too.
Like he was making his own, collection of death.
And it makes you wonder how many other deaths were just, labeled wrong or missed completely. We know some were called accidents at first, like James Tyree. He died because Harvey gave him the wrong catheter. Later, Harvey admitted he did that on purpose.
That's just, now you can't trust any death that happened when Harvey was around. It's terrifying.
Yeah, that uncertainty is part of what makes this case so scary. It shows how our systems can fail,
Yeah.
Even with good intentions, someone like him can slip through the cracks. And as horrible as this is, Harvey wasn't the first or the last healthcare worker to kill patients.
There have been others, angels of death. What makes someone do that? Go from caring for people to killing them?
It's a tough question. There's no easy answer. It's not like there's a list of signs that tell you someone's going to be an angel of death.
Yeah.
But there are things you often see in these cases, like being fascinated by death, needing control, and their sense of empathy. It's kind of messed up. They might think they're being merciful, ending suffering, but really it's about power, having that power over life and death.
And they work in places where people die all the time, so it's even harder to spot them. They seem nice, caring, which makes it even worse.
Absolutely. Think about the patients. They're already sick, in pain. They have to trust these caregivers. And then that trust is betrayed in the worst possible way. It hurts the victims, their families, everyone.
It's like a ripple effect, these crimes. People stop trusting hospitals, families are scared, and the people who worked with these killers, they must feel awful. Like, could they have stopped it?
It's a trauma that affects everyone. We need to make sure healthcare workers are checked carefully. There are rules for reporting anything suspicious, and people can speak up without being scared. Silence can be dangerous. We saw that with Harvey.
Right. And speaking of that, let's talk about how the media covered this case and the impact it had. It was a huge story, and for good reason. It had everything, a normal-looking killer, innocent victims, a complicated investigation, and a really messed up psychology to try and understand.
The media, they played a big role in this case. They helped catch Harvey, and they shape how the public saw him. That team at WCPO-TV, led by Pat Menarson, they deserve a lot of credit for not giving up. Their work got awards, and it really showed how bad things were.
And those nurses who finally spoke up after being ignored before, that was incredibly brave. They could have stayed quiet, but they knew they had to say something.
Yeah, they showed how important whistleblowers are. They tell the truth, even when it's risky, and they make sure people are held accountable. In this case, it was their courage that brought justice and maybe saved more lives.
This case, people are still fascinated by it even years later. There are documentaries, podcasts, even a TV show, Criminal Minds did an episode about it. Why do you think that is?
True crime stories, they just grab people's attention. I think we want to understand the bad things people do, try to make sense of it. Harvey's case, it's scary because it breaks our trust, especially in healthcare. It shows us that evil can be anywhere, even disguised as someone who cares.
And it reminds us that we can't just assume we're safe. We have to be careful, think critically, especially when we're talking about vulnerable people. But before we get too far, I want to ask you, the listeners, what do you think about all this? What stands out to you? What about the ethics of mercy killing? It's a tough issue.
Yeah, it really is. Where's the line between being compassionate and taking a life? What can we do to stop people from abusing that? How do we protect people while also respecting their choices? These are questions we need to think about, especially after a case like this.
We encourage you to look into this case more and learn about other angels of death if you're interested. There's a lot out there, and these cases can teach us a lot about how people behave and why we need to be careful, especially in healthcare.
And before we wrap up, we want to leave you with one last question to think about. What makes someone become an angel of death? What's going on in their minds?
Is it power? Lack of empathy? Do they want to play God? These are the questions that keep criminologists and psychologists up at night.
So as you think about this case, remember how society, the system, and individual choices all play a part in these tragedies.
We hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of the Donald Harvey case, and we encourage you to keep learning about this fascinating and disturbing topic. It's the question you keep asking yourself after, you forget the details. What turns someone into an angel of death? Like, what makes Donald Harvey? Is it like how they grow up, something wrong in their head, or just bad choices?
It really is. It's a mystery that experts still can't figure out completely. You can't just point to one thing and say, that's why he did it. But if we look at his life, his actions, we might find some clues.
Okay, so let's start with his childhood. The abuse. That had to affect him deeply, like how he saw himself, how he connected with people.
Oh, absolutely. Trauma like that, especially when you're a kid and it goes on for years, it can really mess you up. It can change how you feel empathy, how you trust people, even your sense of right and wrong. Sometimes it makes people need to be in control, to have power over others because they felt so powerless when they were being abused.
And you see that need for control in what Harvey did. It started with those mercy killings, but then it got worse. Like he started to enjoy it, the killing itself.
Exactly. If he did start out wanting to help, and that's a big if, it got twisted, became something dark, that power over life and death, it took over. It shows how good intentions can go wrong, especially if someone isn't mentally healthy and doesn't have a strong sense of right and wrong.
And those suicide attempts, his mental problems, those were signs, weren't they? But no one seemed to notice or do anything.
That's an important point.
Hmm?
Mental health issues, especially with trauma in the past, can be really dangerous. We need to be more aware of that, not just for healthcare workers, but for everyone. If we help people early on, give them support, and don't make them feel ashamed for having mental health problems, maybe we could prevent some of these horrible things from happening.
And the fact that he kept trophies, like that hair from Cleo Fish. That shows he was planning this, he was fascinated with death. It wasn't just about ending a life.
Yeah, that's a really disturbing detail. It tells us there was something really wrong with him. He needed to own it, not just the killing, but the memory of it, too. This is where understanding the psychology of these killers can be helpful. There are ideas like malignant narcissism or the McDonald triad that can help us understand why they do what they do, but we can't use that to excuse their behavior.
And the scariest part is they seem so normal. Like they blend in, they seem caring, so you'd never suspect them.
That's one of the hardest things about these cases. The same qualities that make someone seem like a good caregiver can also hide something terrible. It means we have to be extra careful, not just believe what we see and question everything, especially when people's lives are at stake.
After what Harvey did, the healthcare system had to change. Stricter rules, background checks, more supervision, and just being more aware of the possibility of this happening again.
It was a wake-up call, but it came at a terrible cost. All those innocent lives. The changes they made probably saved lives and made hospitals safer. But can we ever really stop something like this from happening again?
That's a really tough question. We can't predict how people will act, and there's no perfect system that will find every single person who might do something like this. But we can learn from what happened, be more careful, encourage people to speak up if they see something wrong, and make sure patient safety is the most important thing.
And we can't forget about those nurses who tried to warn people about Harvey. They were brave to speak up, even when no one listened. In the end, they helped catch him. They're the real heroes in this story.
They are, and they show us that we all have a responsibility to protect people, to speak up when something's wrong, and to never be afraid to tell the truth. So as we finish this deep dive into the Donald Harvey case, what will you take away from it? What will you remember?
I'll remember how much darkness there can be in people's hearts, but also the courage, the people who fight for what's right, even when faced with something so horrible. We can't forget what we learned from this case, for the sake of the victims and for ourselves.
Thanks for joining us on this journey into the mind of Donald Harvey. We hope this deep dive has given you some insights, made you think, and maybe even empowered you to act. Remember, knowledge is power, and the more we understand the darkness, the better we can fight for the light.